we probably think of President Penrose, whom I quote, was best known for working tirelessly to expand the university's academic profile. Or maybe you think of the prestigious Penrose Award, or perhaps of memories in the Penrose Hall that's being currently totally renovated. Or maybe of the book That They May Have Life, the story of AUB from 1866 to 1941 that President Penrose wrote. It won't surprise you to hear that President Penrose's son is equally impressive. After retiring from a very successful career at ExxonMobil, Steve focused his enormous energy on supporting several nonprofit organizations in Dallas. Steve is a true community volunteer, someone who embodies the values of servant leadership that President Khoury often speaks about. I met Steve over a month ago on my first visit to Dallas. I was impressed by many things, especially how quickly we connected. I think this is because of that powerful AUB link that we all share and that enriches our lives in so many ways. Steve told me about CASA, the organization that supports children who have been placed in custody of the courts. Speaking to him, I could hear his passion and commitment. He brings his passion and commitment to many other activities he's involved in, like the Dallas Zoo, or the Dallas Opera, or the Dallas Theater Center. Thank you, Steve, for dedicating your time and talent to serve others. Thank you for being here with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Penrose.
Thank you, Angela, for that very gracious introduction, and the Dallas chapter for having me here. It's such a pleasure, it's a privilege and an honor to be back in an AUB community again. I'm grateful for your hospitality, not just to me, but to my daughter, Meg, who's with us tonight, who lives in Plano, who is named after my mother, who you'll hear a bit more later. I had the opportunity to speak at an AUB event once before. The fact that that was 57 years ago may give you an idea of what the success was. If you're reaching for your wine glass now, I'd encourage that. The occasion of that first address was when my mother and I traveled to Beirut in 1961 for the dedication of Penrose Hall, which you just heard is desperately in need of innovation to bring it into the 21st century. My grandsons would say the same about me, and I hope that you won't agree with them at the end of the evening. I was asked to say a few words about my family's association with AUB, and I'm delighted to do so, but I'll ask you at the outset, please, to suspend your disbelief. The world I knew in Beirut many years ago may seem like it took place on a planet far, far away. From this distance and by today's standards, it may seem tranquil. For a family, and particularly a child, that may have been almost true, but definitely not for AUB. It was 90 years ago that my father, Stephen Penrose Jr., the son of a missionary, first went to Beirut. Having just graduated from Whitman College in Washington State, he served as one of the junior instructors, known then as staffites, at AUB, which until a few years before that had been known as the Syrian Protestant College. He taught physics there from 1928 to 1931, and his love for the institution and for the country never left him. After returning to the US to complete his education, he followed years of teaching here with a period as assistant director of the Near East Colleges Association, spent time in Cairo during the Second World War, And in 1948, he was appointed president of AUB, which had had only 3 presidents before him in its illustrious 80-year history. He held that position only 6 years, until his death in 1954 at age 46. His grave, appropriately, is in Beirut. My mother, my 2 older sisters, Polly and Dale, and I left the following year. So I lived in Lebanon for a grand total of only 7 years. Not really very long at all. It was, however, long enough for the country and its people to become part of my DNA. It is not uncommon for me to hear that period described as a golden age for Beirut and Lebanon. And in many respects, that was true. Beirut was thriving economically as a financial hub of American and Lebanese commercial interests, which grew rapidly after the war. And the city attracted diplomatic and financial delegations from around the globe. It was a beautiful place, as I know you can imagine, described as the Paris of the Middle East. But the times were hardly peaceful. As this audience well knows, 1948 was a tragically difficult year in the region, and my mother and her colleagues among the AUB faculty-wise spent hours each week making up powdered milk and delivering it with donated food and clothing to the then newly established Palestinian refugee camps. My father, traveling widely to raise money for AUB, was denounced in very harsh terms for his testimony on behalf of the Palestinian cause, and was often labeled an anti-Semite. Back in Beirut, demonstrations against him by student nationalists at AUB occasionally caused my home, Marquardt House, to be surrounded by protection by well-armed police. A distinguished former Lebanese Prime Minister, Gala was assassinated in 1951, and immediately thereafter, Jordan's King Abdullah was also assassinated. The Egyptian monarchy was overthrown in 1952, and thereafter Britain and Egypt feuded steadily over control of the Suez Canal zone. Syria experienced several military coups between 1949 and 1954, when then military leader Adib Shishakli was in turn overthrown and replaced with a series of weak sectarian coalitions. Also in 1954, though it was secret at the time, Czechoslovakia began arms deliveries to Egypt. 2 years later, Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt. And 2 years after that, in 1958, the Hashemite Iraqi monarchy was overthrown and American Marines landed on the beaches in Beirut to bolster the government of Camille Chamoun after an outbreak of sectarian violence in Lebanon itself. So a golden age in some respects, perhaps, but all too familiar exceptions. Now, I had no inkling of any of these problems when I, a boy of 4 years of age, arrived in Beirut with my family. To me, then and always, it was simply obvious that Beirut was a special place. I went to a small nursery school, and all my first friends were Lebanese. Those friendships continued later after many of us joined my sisters at the American Community School. And among my friends there were several whose surnames an AUB audience will recognize. Doug Kerr, whose older brother Malcolm later served as president of the university, and parenthetically, whose nephew Steve Kerr is the very successful coach of the Golden State Warriors. And Gay and Eleanor Dorman, whose brother Peter also served as president. At the same time back then, my uncle was teaching at Aleppo College. So travels by car to Aleppo or Damascus were normally family reunions, as were picnics at Baalbek, at the Croix de Chevalier. The world outside might occasionally be a scary place, but the sense of safety and community we felt is almost inconceivable today, anywhere. At age 7 or 8, I was allowed to roam the campus at will, climbing the huge banyan tree in front of what was once the University Observatory, digging unwelcome holes in the clay tennis court which then adjoined Marquardt House, and even to leave the campus by myself and cross Rue Bliss, which had a tram in those days, for a haircut or to spend more time than really appropriate sitting on the floor of Hayat's bookstore, leafing through comic books. We all went swimming at the AUB swimming area just below the Corniche. We joined other faculty families in regular weekend excursions to the hills by Ainab and to the Dorman home in Chemelin to play softball, and to the cedars and the natural bridge where we children hunted for fossil fish and my mother for wild purple or black iris. At age 9, I was drafted into an AUB student production of the play Life with Father, where my onstage brothers, the twins Samir and Nadim Khalif, both later distinguished members of the AUB faculty, made sure I got safely home after each rehearsal. I can still recite the rather garbled spelling which my character in that play gave the word Constantinople. Marquand House was transformed from a dignified symbol of the institution's educational heritage to a playground for 3 small children. The meeting room for the faculty senate adjoined the ground floor of my home, and on at least one occasion the proceedings were interrupted by an aria from my teenage sister Dale, whose bedroom was immediately above and who imagined herself an opera singer. The Honorable Minister of Education of Lebanon was greeted on one ceremonial Christmas visit by a speeding bright red toy fire truck, which, to my mother's surprised horror, I had inadvertently launched from a neighboring hallway. These and other escapades my sisters and I might very much like to have disappear from the record, but they were unfortunately captured in embarrassing and often hilarious detail in my mother's letters. Other transformations were taking place. AUB had a remarkable history. For example, an oft-cited statistic is that in 1945, the largest delegation of graduates to the San Francisco conference, which established the United Nations, came from AUB. However, the Second World War had drained the university of people and resources and enforced a degree of uneasy hibernation. As a result, in 1948, AUB was not quite the jewel it is today. In one of his first letters to his family in the States in October of 1948, my father wrote, quote, "I cannot begin to give you any detail of the problems which I am discovering, but I can say that they are pretty knotty and difficult, both as regards finance and morale. The two are closely associated. Then there are the problems of new buildings, housing, library, alumni, student life, and spirit. I have an excellent cabinet in Zurich, Crawford, and Stewart, so I am not alone. But this is obviously not going to be an easy job," unquote. Before long, however, an Arab Studies program was established, as were the schools of engineering, agriculture, and public health, and the Department of Public Administration. New buildings included the Jaffet Memorial Library, the Bechtel School of Engineering, Gulbenkian Infirmary, and a new wing for the University Hospital. Faculty came from 24 countries, students from close to 50, and a student council was established. In 1950, the first folk dance festival was held on the athletic field. AUB alumni from around the world became newly engaged in shaping the university's present and future. My mother's letters describe the many visits my father made throughout Lebanon and the region, meeting with leaders of often competing and occasionally hostile political and religious factions to foster a broad coalition of support for the university and particularly for its students. I should add that this was not simply ceremonial schmoozing. In the first year after his inauguration, one major Lebanese political party called for the closure of AUB, and another suggested it should be nationalized because student demonstrators had been disciplined by my father's administration. The university was then, as now, a lightning rod for those angry about American policies in the region, and the fact that its president had long been and continued to be an outspoken public advocate for changes in those policies offered no protection at all. As an institution with an unmistakable American pedigree, AUB was also a magnet for traveling American dignitaries. And my sister's autograph books contain the signatures of Helen Keller, who stayed with us in Marquand House, Eleanor Roosevelt, with whom my father apparently had a small disagreement over Palestine, Justice of the Supreme Court William O. Douglas, and countless others. I was personally far less impressed with these luminaries than by the sailors from the U.S. Sixth Fleet, who visited Beirut every 6 months, bringing candy from the States and providing competition for the AUB basketball team. The fleet's aircraft carrier, too large for Beirut Harbor, usually anchored right opposite Marquand House and flashed a farewell signal on its departure. We always mobilized our own fleet of mirrors and sent flashing signals back. Obviously, lots of things have changed since those days, but nothing more than the speed of travel and communication. Because of the limited range of aircraft, in 1948, it took my family more than 2 days to fly directly from New York. We stopped in Newfoundland, London, Brussels, and Istanbul. And at that time, our destination had to be Damascus because the Beirut airport was too small. Urgent news could be cabled by Western Union. The university's cable address then, which amused me no end, was AMUNOB, and I loved the sound of AMUNOB and would repeat it, even though I had no cables to send. However, normal mail took weeks. My mother wrote faithfully to our family back in the States, but one could never be sure when a reply might be coming. No Amazon Prime. Clothes sent from the U.S. as Christmas gifts had often been outgrown by the time they arrived. Still, that meant we concentrated on the people around us, family and friends, and new friends, because each year there were new families associated with AUB, and all the other businesses and institutions in Beirut, just as others moved on. I learned for the first time, though not for the last, to cherish those friendships, however brief they seemed, because one never knew when paths would happily cross again. Indeed, more than a decade after my family left Beirut, when my late wife and I were married, the minister who presided at the ceremony was Dr. Daniel Bliss, grandson of AUB's founder. So fast forward to 2009, when I returned to Beirut for the first time since 1961, accompanied by my daughter Kate. President Gorman happened not to be in town, but we were able to visit Marquand House, wander through the garden which my mother had tended, marvel at the purple blossoms adorning the jacaranda tree by the driveway where I learned to ride a bicycle, look out over those same terraces and the athletic field to the same deep blue sea, and to see friends. We visited with my elementary school classmate Leila Ferris Alamuddin, daughter of the beloved AUB professor of history Nabi Ferris, who was an exceptional scholar and of immense help to my father, and who, I discovered, was eventually buried next to him. Kate and I also enjoyed time with another classmate of Leila's and mine, David Kurani, now emeritus professor of fine arts, who just celebrated his 50th anniversary of teaching at AUB, whose painting of Marquand House adorns my home in Dallas, and whose mother was one of the forces behind that first folk dance festival back in 1950. I now keep up with David, Leila, and Eleanor via that 21st century refurbishment Facebook. During our visit in 2009, Kate and I went again to the Cedars, to the Natural Bridge, through the checkpoints in the Bekaa Valley to Baalbek, the Croix de Chevalier, and spent a week in Damascus and a week in Aleppo. Despite the security concerns which led my sisters to choose not to travel to the region, we found nothing but genuine cordiality everywhere we went in Lebanon and Syria. Obviously, our timing was very lucky with respect to the places we visited, and we've mourned with the rest of the world as those places and their peoples have more recently been tragically tested by war and destruction. Again, Lebanon has been called upon to provide sanctuary to waves of refugees, And again, AUB has played a prominent role in ministering to them. That completes the story of my direct contact with AUB, but I'd like to close with two thoughts at possible relevance today. Firstly, the university is not now and never has been immune to the currents in the region. But I, and I hope you as well, remain optimistic. In August 1941, in the introduction to his history of AUB, published in that year of horrific global turmoil and justifiable fears of worse to come, my father wrote of the university, quote, "Military developments are likely to determine the immediate future of the institution. However, its history shows that it is not unaccustomed to hardships and obstacles of a seemingly overwhelming nature. There is ground for full confidence that it will continue to function successfully and with expanded usefulness long after the clouds of war have disappeared." It's 77 years and many clouds of war later, but those words might be written today. Secondly, a word on the subject of missionaries. My father, and indeed my mother, who was born to a medical missionary in very rural Mexico, came from a particular missionary tradition, and so obviously do I. AUB was nurtured in that tradition. But of course, being a missionary is not limited to a particular faith. Meg, Kate, and I have lived in many places in the world, and to one who looks, there are everywhere examples of people serving others regardless of creed. Here in Dallas now, I try to follow that example, as no doubt do you. The needs here as elsewhere are never-ending, and the missionary passion to help where one can is also part of my DNA. I credit AUB for reinforcing it in my father and mother, and through them, in me. It is a gift without price. You, I, we all share it with that tradition and can be proud of being ambassadors, or perhaps even missionaries, for an AUB which carries that message of service to others in Dallas, in Lebanon, and around the world. AUB today, as before, seeks to inspire its students in that tradition, and I, in turn, am inspired to do what I can to help. Thank you again for your hospitality and for your attention.